So, what should my kid be drinking? It sounds like a simple question until you realize the answer changes depending on which guideline you're looking at. Water, milk, juice, plant-based alternatives, protein drinks, flavored seltzers, functional beverages, and don't even get me started on energy drinks. It's no wonder parents are confused. And let's be honest, so are a lot of providers. I'm Colleen, a PA, dietitian, and your nutrition mentor. Welcome to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast, your guide to giving better nutrition advice. Today, we're cutting through the beverage buzz and getting clear, evidence-based answers. I'm joined by Megan Lott, a registered dietitian and the Deputy Director of Healthy Eating Research, a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She works at the Duke Global Health Institute and has led groundbreaking efforts to align national guidelines from groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and the American Heart Association into one unified set of beverage recommendations for kids. And trust me, this isn't just another set of nutrition rules. Megan shares why the phrase "drink more water" doesn't go far enough, how you can navigate milk choices, including all the different plant-based alternatives, and why your patient's one little sports drink might be more sugar than soda. You'll also learn the exact ounce recommendations for water by age and why thirst isn't always a reliable guide for hydration in kids. We'll talk about which non-dairy milks come closest to cow's milk in nutritional quality and how you can navigate beverages with natural sweeteners like honey and agave. So whether you're in pediatrics, family medicine, a parent, or you're just sick of Googling, "Is oat milk okay for toddlers?" You're going to love this episode. So grab your coffee, get comfy, and enjoy my conversation with Megan. Megan, we're talking about a topic so near and dear to my heart. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation today.
So let's get right into exactly what the healthy eating research is, and then also the organizations that were involved in creating the new recommendations. And I'm curious also what the goal was with doing this.
Yeah, so Healthy Eating Research is a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we're based at Duke University. And basically, we support and disseminate research on policy systems and environmental strategies that promote healthy eating among children with the goal of advancing nutrition and health equity. So basically, everything we do is centered on changing policies and environments to support families and making healthier choices. And that's really how this project came about. We were hearing from parents and families that they were confused about which beverages were really healthy or not, given so many options in the marketplace. And when we started digging into existing recommendations, we realized they were kind of all over the place. Many existing recommendations did not provide guidance on all of the different beverages that exist today. And when they did, there were differences in either how much they recommended or whether they covered everything. And even the dietary guidelines for Americans don't really touch on beverages that much. So we decided to pull together some of the leading health and nutrition organizations working in the field, including the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Heart Association to see if we could get these groups to get to one set of recommendations, really have everyone agreeing on them to make it easier for families and hopefully inform future policies.
Oh, I love that. And you're so right. Even as a provider, I'm like, well, this guideline says this, and then this one says that. So you can see how it can be confusing for parents and patients alike, but also for providers too. But I'm curious as to how were the recommendations determined and what research or evidence did you guys pull from?
Yeah, so we had a really thorough process. First, we reviewed all of the existing guidance or recommendations we found in beverages from both domestic and international authoritative bodies. So this included the dietary guidelines for Americans, also recommendations from the World Health Organization, and as well as the 4 organizations involved, but other clinical practice guidelines that were out there and other guidelines for the federal school meal programs and other child nutrition programs. And this really helped us get a sense of where there was or was not consensus on different beverages or what beverages just weren't covered at all. And then based on that, we conducted structured scoping reviews for beverages where there was a lack of existing recommendations or where recommendations were incomplete or inconsistent. So for example, we did not do an additional scoping review on sugar sweetened beverages because we felt like that's an area where the literature is really well established. It was actually the only beverage type where there was uniform agreement across all existing recommendations that kids and teens shouldn't be drinking them. And, similarly, we know the importance of water for adequate hydration. So we didn't get into that science, but we did do scoping reviews on carbonated water and flavored waters because it was less clear on what the recommendation should be. So in the end, we did conduct detailed reviews for carbonated water, flavored water, plant-based milk alternatives, flavored milk, milk fat in plain pasteurized milk, 100% juice, beverages with non-sugar sweeteners, beverages with caffeine and other stimulants, and then beverages with additives and supplements. As you can imagine, our team was culling through like tens of thousands of articles last spring. So this was definitely a year-long process that involved a lot of people and a lot of research hours.
Quick reminder, if you love this podcast, you will love my weekly newsletter where I share nutrition tips and keep you up to date on the latest guidelines. You can sign up completely for free at examroomnutrition.com/sign up, and the link will be down below in the show notes. Oh yeah, I can imagine. I mean, you guys do cover so many beverages, and I cannot imagine the literature that you guys had to comb through. So what a big undertaking. Now, before we get into the details of what you guys found out, I just want to make it clear for listeners. I'm curious if there were any conflict of interest or funding that we need to be aware of in creating these guidelines.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that question. That transparency is so important to us in this process. So one of the things that we did was we worked with the 4 organizations and we asked each of them to choose 2 representatives to be on this panel. One who could really speak to the organization's policies. And so people who were on staff in the research arm, and one who was a provider expert, a member expert. In addition to those 8 representatives, we had a scientific advisory committee where we pulled together people from across the field that we felt were experts in child development, nutrition, or beverages in particular, and asked them to be a quality control mechanism throughout the process to make sure that the final recommendations were truly reflective of the science and not being swayed too much by one organization versus another. Every single person had to fill out a conflict of interest form. And so there were no declared conflicts of interest in terms of relationships with beverage industry or industry at all. In addition, this project was 100% funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So starting from that point, no industry money involved. This was also important to us in our literature review process. So there's an appendix in the full technical report. I believe it's Appendix C, which is a table of every study reviewed and included in our scoping reviews with a funding source. And we noted where it was industry funded or not, because we also felt that was really important to include.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think that, causes a lot of distrust in the federal government and the guidelines and things like that. So I think you guys did this so well, and this is such well researched, and I really appreciate that transparency. So I'm excited to get into this because you guys actually broke the different beverages down in such a clear manner that makes it really simple to, number one, understand, but also to teach. So what you guys did is you separated it from what to drink, what to limit, and what to avoid. So I wanted to get into the specifics of each of those, starting with what to drink. And so, like you said, water was kind of universally approved and recommended. But one of the most common questions that I get as a pediatric PA is how much? So I would love to hear, what are the guidelines for how much a child should drink, and how do we relay that information to parents?
Yeah, this was an important question we had as well, because while everyone said drink water, you're right. There was nothing out there about how much should my kid or teen be drinking each day. So we actually spent some time digging into adequate intake levels of water. And it's important for people to know that these are really set to avoid dehydration. So we know that kids throughout the US are chronically underhydrated. So most are not drinking enough water based on the literature. These adequate intakes are not an upper limit, but they're really a range to ensure, hopefully, that your kid will not be dehydrated. And so we developed these ranges for kids and teens based on those adequate intakes. So for example, for 5 to 8-year-olds, we recommend 16 to 40 fluid ounces per day, which is about 2 to 5 cups. That's a big range. But a lot of that is also because there's so much individual variation in addition to that based on age, sex, weight, It may also shift day to day based on factors such as the climate where you live or the amount of physical activity your child gets. So this is where that individual level counseling really comes in to help provide some guidance, whereas these are more population level ranges of, in general, the research supports that a child who's 5 to 8 years old should drink between 16 to 40 fluid ounces per day to avoid dehydration. For 9 to 13-year-olds, that range is 22 to 61 fluid ounces, which is about 3 to 8 cups per day. And for 14 to 18-year-olds, it's 29 to 88 fluid ounces, which is about 4 to 11 cups. For 5 to 8-year-olds, it's actually the same whether you're boy, girl, sex assigned at birth. Doesn't really play a role. But as kids get older, we do see that playing a role with different ranges based on whether someone is male or female, based on their biology.
Did you come across some of the guidelines that talk about like half of your body weight in ounces? There is one of those like easy guidelines to use based on the body weight. I'm curious what you guys thought about that.
We did look at some of those. We felt that the evidence was strongest around the adequate intake levels, and that's why we chose to use those as the basis here. But certainly there are cases where if you do that calculation for a child in one of these age ranges, you'll find that it comes into play here. Now, where this starts to get tricky is if you have a child who's large for their age or is clinically overweight or obese, then their water hydration needs also do increase. So that might be a better indicator for those special circumstances.
Yeah. And a quick tip that I always suggest to parents is, yes, these are the guidelines, but I always tell them to instruct their child, even at a young age, to look at the color of their urine to either rehydrate or drink a little bit more if it's too dark. Would you suggest that that's kind of a good recommendation to follow as well?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a good one. Of course, there's a lot of research on urine osmolality and concentration, and it's hard to get down to the individual level for each kid here, but I think generally that color is a good indicator. Another area where there's a lot of research is using thirst as an indicator. And what was interesting was that we found that thirst was actually not an adequate indicator for kids and teens, that a lot of times by the time that they are feeling thirsty, they're already dehydrated. So I think in addition, thirst is a good indicator that you're probably dehydrated and you should be drinking more water, but that shouldn't be the only thing we're using.
What a great point. Okay, let's shift on to milk because we got a lot of topics to cover here. So I'm curious as to why plain unsweetened milk is recommended. I would love to hear your feedback on the research there. And how does that fit into a child's overall nutrition?
Yeah, so plain pasteurized milk is recommended because it provides so many important nutrients that growing kids and teens need, including calcium, phosphorus, fat-soluble vitamins A, K, and D, B vitamins, protein. It's often readily available and affordable in the US, so it makes it kind of a nutrition powerhouse in diets of kids and teens. A couple of points here, though. As a dietitian, I also know that it's nutritionally possible. You can have a nutritionally adequate diet without milk involved. But given these are population level recommendations, we really looked at what are most kids drinking and how do we have the most positive impact for the most kids' health. And so we also look at our recommendations within the context of the whole diet. So one thing you'll notice if you're looking at our summary table is that for milk, we talk about cut fluid ounces of milk or dairy equivalents. And that's really because kids can get their daily intake from foods like cheese or unsweetened yogurt. So for example, 8 fluid ounces of milk is equivalent to about 1 cup of yogurt or 1.5 ounces of cheese. So you'll see the recommendation, again, for like a 5 to 8-year-old needs up to 20 fluid ounces per day of milk or 2.5 cups equivalent of dairy. So it's hard to tease that apart when you're doing beverages versus food. And we really felt like it was more important to communicate to parents, if your child doesn't like milk, they can still meet dairy through yogurt and cheese or other sources. And then they should just drink more water. So their water needs increase as a result.
Now, you said something really important that I just wanted to quickly hit on because it could be an entire podcast episode in and of itself. But you had said you recommend pasteurized unsweetened milk, and that pasteurization is key. And it's a really big hot topic right now. It's become like so popular to drink unpasteurized milk. So I'm just curious if you guys dug into the literature and safety of that. And if you can speak on how can we educate our parents that we recommend pasteurized milk?
Yeah, gosh, it could be a whole podcast topic. Raw milk versus pasteurized milk is very popular right now. And I've read so much on the history of milk pasteurization for this project. that I will spare you from the boring details of how it all started and why it came to be. But I think what I do feel safe concluding after reading all of that is that milk pasteurization is one of the biggest public health triumphs in our history in terms of the amount of pathogens that were delivered through milk or through the milking process was really creating a lot of harm among kids in particular with vulnerable immune systems and anyone else who was immunocompromised, including older adults. And when milk pasteurization was entered into our country, that significantly went down. And we started to see foodborne illnesses under better control and other GI illnesses that were very popular in the early 1900s really take a major downslide. And the evidence is really strong here. We know that there are opportunities throughout, whether it's the milking process, the handling process, the bottling and storage process. These are all opportunities where, in your hazard analysis, critical control point plans, if you're working in food service, you would indicate our risk options for milk to be contaminated. And that milk pasteurization has significantly limited those incidences. So we very strongly recommend pasteurized milk. We feel the evidence is very strong here and that there are way too many risks with raw milk for kids and teens in particular.
Yep, couldn't agree more. And thank you for shedding light on that. So is there such a thing as too much milk? And then also leading into that, when do we switch a child from whole milk to 2%?
Yes, absolutely. There's a such thing as too much milk. And the research has really shown that if kids drink too much milk, it fills them up. And that results in eating fewer foods at meals, which displaces other key nutrients. So for practical tips for families, we suggest that they offer water in between meals and milk with snacks or meals to prevent that overconsumption. And definitely for kids who are big milk consumers, being really aware of how much milk is offered at each occasion is really important to advise parents. The milk fat question is an interesting one. The expert panel generally recommends fat-free or skim or low-fat or 1% milk after 2 years because these options have fewer calories and saturated fats than the higher fat, whole milk or 2% varieties. But there has been new evidence emerging in recent years suggesting that the saturated fat from dairy may not be associated with adverse health outcomes like heart disease as we previously thought. So it's possible 5 years from now, we could see this recommendation shift. But as of right now, not enough evidence has come out that we felt warranted overturning those current recommendations to really first offer fat-free or low-fat milk to children older than 2 years. And given the levels of overweight and obesity in this country, it's probably a prudent recommendation to stick with that for the moment. But still, there may be situations when a higher fat content of milk is appropriate. And these are the decisions, again, that should be made on an individual level by you as the dietitian or a pediatrician.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, so we've talked about dairy milk, but some families opt for plant-based milk alternatives. And this was pretty trendy a couple years ago. And sort of there's always like a new nut milk on the block, so to speak. And so I'm just curious, if I've got a family, a parent sitting in front of me that is pretty sure they don't want to give dairy milk, what is the best alternative that I can support them with?
Yeah, I love talking about plant-based milk alternatives because there's so much confusion around them. And, one of the big points I think is important to raise for families is that making sure that they know no matter what, these plant-based milk alternatives are not nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk. There's so much variety between products, but also even within a product. If you pulled 4 almond milks off the shelf and looked at their nutrition labels, you would see differences in what each contain. One other quick note is that the bioavailability of the nutrients in plant-based milks, we just don't know as much about it. So we know that it's easier for our bodies to absorb the nutrient in cow's milk because it comes from an animal-based source. A lot of the nutrients are more readily available. But in a plant-based source, we still don't know, can we actually absorb all that calcium in this plant-based milk the same way as a cow's milk? So that's a research gap. We need to know more. But one thing that I want to also point out is most parents don't realize that these plant-based milk alternatives are not as nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk. So that means if you're serving them as a milk substitute, kids and teens could be missing out on key nutrients for optimal growth and health. And the other thing I like to point out is that the flavored varieties also have they're high in added sugars, which can be harmful to kids' health. So it's really important to have families first look for varieties that are fortified and varieties that do not have any additives that are like the flavorings that or added sugar. So If your child needs, or this is the path you're going down, a plant-based milk alternative, soy milk or one of the pea milk blends are, from our research, the two that are most nutritionally equivalent. Soy milk is recognized by the dietary guidelines for Americans as an alternative to dairy milk. The pea milk blends haven't been recognized as explicitly. It'll be interesting in this new edition to see if they come out. But the way that like federal child nutrition programs have changed their guidelines, they now have limits for the different nutrients, and the pea milk blends do meet those. So that's another option. We have a great resource that we put together that compares the different varieties among protein, fat, calcium, vitamin D, et cetera, and can be a great cheat sheet for you as providers to really use to help guide you in making that decision for your client. So many people are either like they love milk or hate milk, or they love plant-based milks or both. And I feel like I'm actually, there's a place for everything. We just have to know what we're recommending.
Now, we've talked about water and we've talked about milk, about what to drink. So let's move on to what to limit. And I love that key word there, is what to limit. And so I first want to talk about juice, because that was one of the bigger things that you guys looked at in the research. And sometimes, especially parents, think that 100% juice is seen as a healthy choice, but you guys suggest limits. And so I'm curious as to what the reasoning is behind that, and how much should we recommend children should drink with juice?
Yeah, 100% juice can provide great nutrients like vitamin C, and can especially be important for times of the year when access to fresh fruits and vegetables is lower, or to families who might be living with more limited incomes and can't always afford fresh fruits and vegetables. But we know that dietary fiber is also a nutrient of concerns for kids and teens in particular. They're not getting enough each day. And so that's a big part of why we recommend limiting the juice, because we want kids to really be meeting their daily fruit and vegetable group recommendations through whole fruits and vegetables. They're going to get more nutrients, more fiber. And so that's really the preference. 100% juice can have a place in the diet, but we really want whole fruits and vegetables. And so that's the big recommendation behind limiting it. And the limits are pretty small, which surprises a lot of parents. Like, it's only 4 to 6 ounces for 5 to 8-year-olds, 6 to 8 ounces per day for 9 to 13-year-olds, and 8 ounces or 1 cup max for 14 to 18-year-olds.
Yeah, it's not a lot, right? It's, for most of them, it's less than a cup. And so I think that's a really important educational piece because of what you just said. Like, their diets are not meeting the fiber, and we'd rather them get that sweet, fruit flavor from the natural food itself. Let's move on to sports drinks. And it's interesting because a lot of research doesn't really look at this with kids in the general population. So I love that you guys address this. And a lot of people assume that if a child is active, they need a sports drink. So I'm curious as to what you guys found in the literature of when are they actually needed?
Yeah, I feel like this comes up so much. Everyone thinks like, my kid's an athlete, they need sports drinks. And they're often marketed as having performance enhancing benefits. But the truth is they're not needed for most kids. They're really only appropriate for athletes or people engaged in prolonged, vigorous physical activity, or for when activities might be performed in like really high temperatures and humidity. So the sweat release and electrolyte loss is higher. So the reality is water is still the best option for the average child or adolescent engaging in routine physical activity. And what we mean by that is really anything less than 3 hours. Or for high intensity activity like running, if it's less than 1 hour in normal weather conditions, you don't need a sports drink. Water is great. So even that like 1 hour soccer game on a weekend, water is probably just fine. If you're a high school football player doing 2-a-days in the August heat and humidity, you might need a sports drink to help with that electrolyte loss. It's also important to think, they contain a lot of additives and supplements that are understudied. These additives may include non-sugar sweeteners, caffeine and other stimulants, prebiotics, probiotics, vitamins and minerals. And they might not be listed on the nutrition facts label or ingredients list, especially now you see more and more of those powders that you dump into water. We just don't know enough about a lot of these ingredients. And then some of the ones we do know, like non-sugar sweeteners and caffeine, are not recommended for kids in this age group. So it's really important to look at those labels if you are going to give your kid one of these.
Yeah. And we're talking about, the 8-year-old that plays on a soccer team. We're not talking high level collegiate athletes or professional athletes, which is right. Sports nutrition is completely different than general population nutrition. Now, for those of you who are interested in going deeper into this topic, I actually did an entire episode. It's number 71, titled Sports Nutrition Hot Topics, Sugar, Sports Drinks, and Fueling for Performance. And we really unpacked the use for sports drinks for certain children. So after this episode, go check out episode 71, and I'll link down to that in the show notes below. All right, Megan, let's talk about flavored milk. We talked about it a little bit when you mentioned plant-based alternatives, because a lot of them are either like vanilla flavored or chocolate flavored, and it's sometimes is marketed as a good option. So I'm curious, what did you guys find, if it's a concern about the added sugar, and could it be an occasional treat, or should we encourage our children to avoid it altogether?
Yeah, flavored milks are interesting because they have such a health halo. They are, the regular milk with flavoring added, but and with that flavoring often comes the sweetener, so those added sugars. And what people don't realize is they often contain a large amount of added sugar, and just one serving can often meet or exceed a child's recommended daily sugar limit, depending on what it is or how big that serving is. So, for example, 1 cup of low-fat chocolate milk can contain as much as 20 grams or 5 teaspoons of added sugar. That's more than a sports drink. It's about the same as a regular 12-ounce can of soda. So it's a lot. So really, to meet dietary intake recommendations, plain pasteurized milk is preferred over a healthy diet. I would say flavored milk should be more of a treat rather than a daily drink. And the panel goes so far as to say if your kid does not like regular plain milk, offer yogurt, offer cheese. Like, flavored milk is the last resort, which didn't used to be the case. So I think that's really notable about these recommendations, that where all of the groups kind of agreed, given the research and showing, the data on school meals, for example, show that flavored milk is the number one source of added sugar in school meals. That's pretty big.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, we used to say, like, if your child won't drink the plain milk, try chocolate milk. And so I think as nutrition science has evolved, we are seeing the detrimental effects of added sugar on our diets. And I'm glad that you guys addressed that flavored milk, because I have so many patients that are like, oh, I drink strawberry milk. And, it might not be something that you ask. So that might be a great part of your well check to, do they drink milk? If they say yes, maybe you can ask, is it plain? And you'd be surprised how many are like, oh no, she only drinks chocolate milk, or he'll only take strawberry milk. And so that's a great piece of education to talk about the added sugars there. So I love that you guys broke that down in the science. Okay, that leads us really nicely into the final portion that you guys looked at, which was drinks to avoid. And since we're talking about sugar, a big one was the sugar sweetened beverages. And so I would love to hear, like, before you give us the specific drinks that are included in this group, can you just remind us what the recommended limits are for added sugars in a child's diet?
Yeah, so the dietary guidelines for Americans recommend that people consume no more than 10% of their daily calories from added sugar. And that's equivalent to about a maximum of 50 grams a day based on a 2,000 calorie diet. Now, for younger kids who have much smaller bodies and lower calorie needs, it's even less than that. And many of today's popular drinks contain so much added sugar that just 2 sugary drinks a day could nearly double that recommended sugar limit. Not to mention, there's added sugar in things that we eat every day, whether it's salad dressings, spaghetti sauces, breads, cereals. So you can make a big impact on your diet just by eliminating the beverages, which is part of the reason that SSBs, I think, we come down so hard on them, because they don't normally add any nutritional benefits to the diet. It's just an easy way to reduce those added sugars.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so what beverages are included in the sugar sweetened beverage group?
So thankfully now you can look at a nutrition facts label and look for that added sugar row. If it has anything above 0, it has added sugars. But these types of beverages often are sports drinks, sodas, fruit drinks or fruit aids. That includes lemonades, aguas frescas, which are often homemade sweetened watered beverages. Other sweetened waters, like a lot of the bottled flavored waters, have added sweeteners as well. But I think that's a good rule of thumb. If you look at the added sugar and you see anything above a 0, it's a sugar sweetened beverage.
I want to unpack something here that's also pretty common on social media right now with we're talking about sugar. Some social media influencers, right, that have no nutrition background are claiming that like agave or honey or these other quote natural sweeteners are better options. Did you guys look into any of those types of sweetened beverages, and do you have any guidelines on that?
Yeah, I mean, from a nutritional standpoint, the calories per gram is the same, whether it comes from honey or table sugar or something that is quote unquote less natural. And so for the purpose of those sweetened beverages do include things sweetened with agave or honey. If it adds calories and it's a simple sugar, your body processes it the same way.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, getting kids to drink water, right? We've kind of been honing in on water, water, water. It's really tough, especially if they're so used to drinking these high sugar content drinks. So, what are some of your top tips for making that switch to water easier?
Yeah, one of the great things is that most kids and teens are now bringing water bottles to school. And sometimes it can be as simple as choosing a fun water bottle in their favorite color, letting your teen or tween have the trendy style. I have my older two are twin girls in sixth grade. And last year it was all about the Stanley Cup. This year it's all about the Awala water bottle. Another thing to do is experiment with adding fresh fruit or frozen berries to water to add flavor. Infused waters can be really delicious. They add a bit of flavor for those who don't really like the taste of water, but without adding sugar. You can also experiment with herbs like mint or rosemary, or spices like cinnamon can be fun additions. But I think the important thing is to remind families that change takes time. These recommendations are the like quote unquote gold standard. And for most families, like most nutritional changes, it's going to take some experimentation to figure out what will work best for them and their kids. But what's important is to help them recognize the importance of continuing to try, and that what they drink is just as important as what they eat. So even something as simple as taking one sugary drink a day, if your kid drinks many, down to a cup of water is a huge change that's going to make important impacts over time. And so it, as cliche as it is, it's the marathon and not the sprint, and to just keep persevering through these changes.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I think I saved the best two types of beverages for the end, but a lot of teens are drinking these energy drinks and diet sodas, which have a lot of non-sugar sweeteners and additives in there. So I'd love to hear what you guys found regarding if they're appropriate and safe or not.
So let's start with non-sugar sweeteners. In recent years, there's been new evidence emerging, mostly in adults, suggesting that non-sugar sweeteners may actually not help control body weight like we originally thought, and that their increased use over time really can also increase the risk of diet-related chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular health. There's also new research showing that consumption of non-sugar sweeteners impacts our gut microbiomes in ways that we're just starting to learn more about. So, the reality is, in general, there's a lot we don't know. We know even less when it comes to kids and teens and the long-term effects of non-sugar sweeteners. And childhood and adolescence are critical developmental periods characterized by rapid physical, neurological, cognitive, and social growth and development. So given all of that, the expert panel felt really strongly that this is where expert opinion came in for them. Any beverages containing non-sugar sweeteners, whether naturally derived or artificial, should be avoided because we just don't know enough about the long-term impacts on our kids' health.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the microbiota because that's an emerging area in research that we're just learning so much about now. So what are your thoughts, though, if you've got a child who is stuck on regular soda and they're drinking 5 of them a day? Would it be an appropriate step down to say, can we try these sugar-free alternatives or not? Is that what the guideline is saying? Like, don't even use that as a bridge, use water as a bridge instead.
Yeah, I think this is where the science and reality don't always match up, right? Because the science would support, based on these expert panels' recommendations, it would be best to go from regular soda to water and just working on, rather than finding sort of a different beverage to substitute in place of the soda, can we replace one soda a day with 1 cup of water and work on that gradual change? In reality, we know sometimes that's not going to work for every kid. And so that's probably an individual level decision. It's a hard one to make because even when you look at the different non-sugar sweeteners, often I'll get asked, well, like, what about the natural ones like stevia or monk fruit? Or is there one that's better than the other? And the reality is we also don't know the answer to that. I'd love to be able to tell clients, yes, it's a safe option, but we don't know that. And that's often because most drinks contain more than one. So they're often in products where there's 2 or 3 at a time. So doing the research to tease apart which one is like quote unquote better for us or worse for us can also be really hard. It's another research gap we call out in the report. I just don't know that we know enough yet to be able to guide people that way.
Yeah. The market has really been booming with these soda waters, seltzer waters, and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on that? And if it's recommended, what should we guide our parents to look for regarding those alternative beverages?
Yeah, the quote unquote like healthy sodas with
Mhm.
probiotics and
Yes.
prebiotics and these like the industry calls these functional beverages, which I
Right.
found interesting and we learned in throughout this process because they're really looking at like what are these ingredients that they can market as having a health enhancing effect. The reality is the research is not there to support many of these claims. And so one of the scoping reviews we did, but we don't have a separate category in our recommendations on this, are beverages with additives and supplements. And we tried to break it down and look at some of these things like these quote unquote healthy sodas that have the prebiotics and probiotics and other additives in there. And what we found was there is just not a big enough body of evidence for us to make any conclusions. So are there health benefits to some of these? Maybe, but honestly, there isn't literature to support them. So there may be some proprietary industry, private literature that they have to defend whatever health claim they're putting on their product if called into question, but it is not in the peer-reviewed literature that we reviewed for this product. So that was tricky. We ended up not doing recommendations on that category because there's so many that fall into this category, so many new additives, so many new products that we just don't know enough about to make any conclusion on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, straight carbonated water, good old seltzer water, maybe there's some lemon juice or natural, juice squeezed in there. Would that be an appropriate alternative?
So carbonated water is something that I learned a lot about also in this project, especially on oral health. Our pediatric dentist colleagues really brought a lot to the table on this one because that's where the evidence really came up around carbonated and flavored carbonated waters. So water has a pH of 7, which is neutral. Most plain carbonated waters have a pH in the range of 5 to 7. And this is an area where, occasional consumption, no negative oral health benefits. But any beverage with a pH less than 5, you start to see dental erosion, increased incidence of cavities, and other poor oral health benefits. Unfortunately, most of the flavored sparkling waters have a pH below 5, and that's because that flavoring is added through acids. So if you had a plain carbonated water and squeezed fresh lemon juice in at home, I can't tell you for sure what the pH level of that beverage is, but if you bought a lemon flavored sparkling water at the grocery store, most of those have a pH between 3 to 5. And so again, every once in a while, probably not a problem, but using those multiple times every day, the evidence does support negative oral health outcomes, especially for children, where we already see increased evidence of dental caries in large consumers of sugar-sweetened beverages as well.
Oh my gosh, that is so fascinating. Oftentimes we forget that the teeth are affected so much by what we consume. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. Very, very interesting. Okay, we're going to round out this conversation with one of the final things that you guys suggested to avoid, and that is caffeinated beverages. So what do you guys know? What did you find out about the impact of caffeine, and what is the limit for teens?
So while most adults can safely consume caffeine in limited quantities, kids and teens have smaller bodies, rapidly developing brains. So even, a 15-year-old who is a larger male, for example, that might rival some small women sizes, still, let's remember, rapidly developing brains, lots of changes going on. They are more susceptible to the negative effects of consuming too much caffeine. And the evidence shows that consuming caffeine can lead to poor sleep quality, including delayed sleep onset, more sleep disturbances and shorter sleep duration, increased blood pressure. And this was really important, an increase in mental health conditions, including depressive moods, anxiety, stress, and self-harm in kids and teens. And even small amounts of coffee or caffeine, like a cup of coffee, can have these negative side effects. This was an area where of all the beverages we reviewed, the evidence was the strongest. We didn't even include the case studies of the teenagers showing up at the hospital in cardiac arrest because they had these like excessive amounts of caffeine. We're just talking about the longer term reviews looking at kids who drank, 2 to 3 caffeinated beverages a day or fewer. And the other thing to point out is most of these caffeinated drinks that are popular with kids and teens have large amounts of added sugars. So you see them with these blended coffee drinks or bottled drinks. They also have multiple stimulants if they're energy drinks. So not just caffeine, but they'll have additional things like taurine. There's a list of 5 or 6 we talked about in the report that are stimulants that have like an added effect of that sort of like hyper focus that caffeine can provide. And these ingredients are not recommended in isolation, let alone when you start to layer them on top of each other, you see even more negative impacts. So ultimately, we don't recommend any caffeine for kids under 18. And I think this is also really notable because it's a new recommendation. A lot of the groups, this was an area where almost nobody had a recommendation before. The AAP, who was part of this, previously had a recommendation of 100 milligrams per day, and they're in the process of revising that as well as a result of this and some other projects they had going on already.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I'm glad to see that they're revising that, because you're right. A lot of kids are loving the fancy frappuccinos and things like that. So I actually did a quick episode on coffee specifically and the question of if it stunts growth. So if you guys are interested in learning a little bit more about that, it's episode 65. But Megan, now that you had said that the AAP might be updating their guideline on caffeine limits, I might have to update that episode. So we'll see as science changes and as literature changes. That's why it's really important for groups like you guys to keep us up to date on the guidelines. And I'm so thankful that you guys created this really comprehensive approach to beverages, because it is just something that comes up constantly throughout, well checks and with our conversations with parents. So I know you guys have all of this printed out in a really, really helpful visual way. So tell us about this resource and where we can find it.
Great. So on our website, healthyeatingresearch.org, we have a whole section called Nutrition Tips for Families. We created a wonderful provider toolkit that I will share with Colleen to share with all of you. It has so many resources, both that you can use in helping to make healthier decisions with your clients and families, but also that you can share directly with them. So handouts you could give them, there's social media content as well if you post on social sites. So we really hope this will be useful. And if you think of more resources, you can always reach out. We're always looking to add to them.
So awesome. And I dug around a little bit on this, and you guys have a really fun beverage measurement tool of you drink this much milk and this much water, and it kind of adjusts and does the math for you. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a really fun thing to create. So we heard a lot from families. We did some focus groups when we were testing the recommendations, and they were like, gosh, it would be so great if you had a tool where we could just go online and say, my kid had 2 cups of milk and a cup of juice. How much water should they be drinking? So we don't have to do the math at home. So we created it. And you'll notice on that Nutrition Tips for Family site that you can choose the age range. So it's adjusted by age range. And then you just move these interactive sliders around based on the level of milk or juice, and it'll tell you how much water. We did not include the other non-recommended beverages for obvious reasons, but it does include that milk, juice, and water. And I think it's been a really fun thing and a really useful tool for families so far.
Oh yeah, I love it. And so if you guys work in pediatrics, this is such a useful tool for you, because I know your time is limited, but if they have questions about beverages, just go direct them to this site. Take some time so you can get educated on all of these updated guidelines, because as you can tell, this is a really comprehensive study and it's got really great tips and guidelines. So I will link to all of that down below in the show notes. But Megan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And this is a huge undertaking. So thank you for providing this to the community.
Yeah, we're so excited to have it out in the world and to be useful to providers and families.